So people right now are feeling quite scared, quite anxious, and a real anxiety. How can we as Catholics help ourselves to overcome, but also help other people to overcome the fear that is just pervasive right now?
Yeah, I mean, fear is understandable. There is a certain, I mean, fear is it's an emotion, and there are, at some level, reasons to be afraid if it provokes us to be prudent and cautious, to observe social distancing and so on. But I think there is no need really to fear in the deeper sense, in the spiritual sense.
Yeah.
Yesterday we heard in the gospel, even the angel Gabriel telling Mary, who had a certain human fear about what was going to happen to her, what this was all going to mean. And the angel says, "Do not fear." The same way Jesus himself in the Garden of Gethsemane had a natural kind of fear, I think, of what was to come. On the other hand, we also know that he kept saying throughout his ministry, "Do not fear, do not be afraid that there is, any deep spiritual harm." And I think this is where our faith comes in, and it is important that we see that the Lord wants to take away a kind of fear and anxiety, which is not a sign of blessing. The spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, one of the ways of discerning is if there is fear or panic or lack of calm interiorly, that lack is a sign of things not going well, not going for the best. And so I think that we have to really rely on our faith and be able to experience both fear as a human emotion and understand that, but not ultimately to be afraid. We're not abandoned. This is not a chastisement or a punishment or anything of that sort.
Right.
And sometimes people start thinking in that way, and I think that's just mistaken.
In the Archdiocese of Vancouver right now, can people still get married? Can they have Mass if they're getting married?
People can certainly, of course, get married. And if the number at Mass was very reduced, as you know, we have no public celebrations of Mass when the Mass time is announced for a congregation. But priests are saying Mass in their parishes, and probably with a few people present. Maybe a secretary or a worker or someone who happens to be there. It seems to me that it would be possible to have a couple and a couple witnesses present for a Mass, probably, and then they would have celebrations and so on later. I think that's the better way. But there's certainly the sacraments go on. It's the same as a baptism can still go on.
Right. We've had questions from people about how best, now that we've got live streaming,
right,
how best to interact on the live streaming Mass. So as an example, do you kneel at the appropriate times? Do you fast an hour before spiritual communion? Do you do the response?
To the latter question, I can say you do not fast before spiritual communion. You don't have to kneel. I think some people, I'm pretty sure, are observing the Mass in a more casual state than they would normally. It depends, I think, just on sort of what helps a person enter into the mystery the best possible way. None of those things are mandated because you're not present before our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. I mean, that's just not true.
Right.
That's happening somewhere else. But as a way of uniting yourself, you could, for example, impose certain practices upon yourself that would, I believe, help your devotion. I'd leave that up to individual people.
Good. What people have asked about drive-thru confessionals. They've seen it elsewhere. Legitimately, is that possible here?
Sure. I mean, it seems to me we're at a point where a lot is left up to the creativity of the priest. If he can sort of arrange, he has a parking lot with cones and so on that he can arrange, that the proper distance would be maintained between the car and the confessor. I saw one place where the priest had to put a little mask not on his mouth but on his eyes so that the anonymity could be preserved. I was reading that of Saint Damien of Molokai. When he had to go to confession, no priest wanted to come to the island. So the priest who was the confessor was out in a boat, and Saint Damien would shout his sins to the priest. So there was more than adequate social distancing, I'm sure. But so, I mean, there are different ways. There are now two, I believe, Father Galvin at the cathedral has some screens that would be protective, that used outside would allow for confession, and also with anonymous confession should one want that. Right. So I think the priest can think up, different ways of hearing confessions.
And confession always does have to be in person. We get a lot of questions about,
yes,
can we?
So yes, the sacrament of confession must be person. It can't be Zoomed. It can't be telephoned, which was a question which rose many years ago, not just in the present crisis, but it does as a sacrament, the sacramental order. That's why the crisis is so jarring, because as Catholics, the sacramental order is so visible and tangible.
Right.
And when we can't use those signs except in extraordinary circumstances, it is extraordinarily upsetting for a church which is sacramental and not just a church of the word, but of word and sacrament.
What advice would you give to people who simply can't get to confession now because of either self-isolation or other concerns?
Yeah, for other concerns. That's long been addressed in the history of the church, and there's always been the practice and the custom of being able to make an act of contrition, perfect contrition, which means that it's an act of contrition not just based on fear,
right,
but on love of God, with the intention to be able to confess one's sins as soon as possible. And I think it's long been the practice that people who would fall in perhaps into a serious sin would, knowing that they can't get to confession even when you could for a few days, they would make an act of perfect contrition,
right, with
the intention. And we know that is in fact the graces work in anticipation of the realization, but they're dependent upon the actual sacramental confession at a later date.
Okay, right. A question was asked, how is the Archdiocese helping the homeless at this time?
Yeah, I mean, we know that the homeless that we care for in many parishes take care of people, but at the Archdiocesan level we have the Doors Open, which is in the downtown east side, right opposite Oppenheimer Park, and they continue to feed, I think, actually an increasing number of people, no longer in the way that was more, how would I say, kind of respectful of people, by they could sit down and have community.
Right.
They're now having to give them sandwiches and so on, but the number has increased. Our shelter, which we've managed since the mid-1950s, continues to receive well over 100 men every night at 150 Robson. I must say that it's heroic for those who work there, that they're continuing to be with the guests and treat the guests. So we're still offering the services that are ours. We also have to remember that the St. Paul's Hospital and so on, the work that it does with the homeless, of course, continues in a marvelous way. It's a great Catholic institution.
Are we doing enough as church? Are we doing enough in this crisis? I know it's a
whenever
question.
I hear the question, doing enough, I say, well, it seems to me we can probably always push ourselves to do a little more, but it is amazing how much people are doing. I see the number of masses that are being streamed online, the ways in which courses people are continuing. An alpha course even will be delivered online.
Right.
Other lectures and talks in parishes, the way pastors are connecting with their people. I think, and we're just discovering, I think, in some ways, the real power of what it means to be online. And I hope that those efforts continue to go ahead, because the current situation might last for a while.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Makani.